A little girl whispers, "She's been here before." Millionaire reviews the logs and exposes her. Before we explore more, hit like if you think human connection is still sacred. Enjoy the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Hart mansion, each ray of light revealing the intricate details of a home built on precision and technology. Dylan Hart had always believed that safety came from systems you could control, algorithms you could trust, and walls that kept the world at bay. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as he watched his 9-year-old foster daughter Chloe push scrambled eggs around her plate, he had no idea that everything he trusted was about to crumble. Chloe Bennett wasn't like other children. Her straight brown hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her dark eyes seemed to catalog every detail around her. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it was genuine. Dylan often wondered if he was enough for her, if a man who spoke more fluently to computers than to people could ever be the father she needed. "The new designer starts today," Dylan said, trying to fill the comfortable silence that often stretched between them. "Ariel Stone. She'll be helping update the user interface for Heart Secure." Chloe nodded, taking another small bite. She'd learned not to get too attached to the temporary people who passed through their lives, consultants, contractors, staff members who came and went like seasons. But something about this morning felt different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Nora Quinn was already in the garden, her weathered hands tending to the lavender beds that bordered the mansion's east wing. At 68, she'd seen 5 different owners of this house, and she'd learned to read the subtle signs that most people missed. Today, the plants seemed restless, their leaves trembling despite the absence of wind. In his basement office, Mr. Rupert Doyle was running his daily diagnostics on the Heart Secure system. Every sensor, every camera, every digital lock reported normal status. The 72-year-old programmer took pride in the fortress he'd helped build. No one could enter this house without his knowledge. No one could access their systems without leaving a digital footprint, or so he believed. As the grandfather clock chimed 8 times, footsteps echoed in the main hallway. Dylan straightened his tie and headed toward the front door. Chloe remained at the breakfast table, but her posture had changed. She was listening now, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. The woman who entered was exactly what Dylan had expected from her portfolio: creative, confident, professionally dressed in a way that suggested both competence and approachability. Ariel Stone had an easy smile and the kind of relaxed energy that made people want to trust her immediately. "Mr. Hart, thank you so much for this opportunity," Ariel said, extending her hand. "I'm really excited to dive into the Heart Secure interface. From what I've seen, it's incredibly sophisticated." Dylan felt himself relax. She seemed genuine, enthusiastic, nothing like the paranoid whispers in his head that constantly reminded him how his former business partner had betrayed him, how trusting the wrong person had nearly cost him everything. "Let me show you to the office," Dylan said. "We can start with a tour of the current system." But as they walked toward the kitchen to grab coffee before the tour, something happened that would change everything. Chloe watched from her seat as Ariel moved through the space with an easy familiarity. Without hesitation, without searching, without even pausing to orient herself, Ariel walked directly to the third drawer from the sink and pulled out a teaspoon. Chloe's fork clattered against her plate. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. "She's been here before," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible but somehow cutting through the morning air like a blade. Dylan turned, frowning. "What did you say, sweetheart?" But Chloe's eyes were locked on Ariel, and Ariel's easy smile had frozen on her face for just a moment. A moment so brief that Dylan missed it entirely, but long enough for a 9-year-old girl who noticed everything to catalog it forever. What secrets hide behind the most familiar faces? Stay with us as we uncover the truth that only a child could see. The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Mrs. Nora working in the garden. Dylan looked between his foster daughter and his new employee, trying to understand what had just happened. "Chloe, honey, what do you mean?" Dylan asked gently, though there was a note of embarrassment in his voice. Ariel was watching them both with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Chloe's small hands gripped the edge of the table. She'd learned to trust her instincts the hard way. First when the fire had started in her birth parents' house and she'd smelled the smoke before anyone else. Then during her time in foster care, when she'd somehow known which adults were safe and which ones weren't. But explaining these feelings to grown-ups had never gone well. She didn't look, Chloe said slowly, her voice stronger now. She didn't look for the spoons. She just knew where they were. Ariel laughed, a light musical sound that should have been reassuring. Oh, that's sweet. I guess I'm just good at reading kitchens. They're all laid out pretty similarly, right? Cutlery usually goes in the drawer closest to the dishwasher. It was a reasonable explanation. Dylan nodded, his concern evaporating. Chloe's very observant, he said to Ariel. Sometimes too observant, for her own good. But Chloe hadn't moved. She was still watching Ariel with those dark, serious eyes that made adults uncomfortable, because it wasn't just the spoon drawer. It was the way Ariel had navigated the hallway without checking room numbers. It was how she'd avoided the loose floorboard by the window, the one that Dylan himself still stepped on occasionally. It was the subtle way she'd glanced up at the corner where the security camera was hidden, just for a split second, as if confirming its position. Why don't you go get ready for school, Chloe? Dylan suggested. Mrs. Patterson will be here to pick you up in 20 minutes. Chloe slid down from her chair, but she didn't head toward the stairs immediately. Instead, she walked past Ariel, close enough to catch a faint scent, something floral and familiar that made her stomach clench with recognition. She'd smelled that perfume before, but not recently. It was buried in her memory alongside other details she couldn't quite access. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Chloe could hear Dylan giving Ariel the tour, their voices growing fainter as they moved toward his office. She paused at the top of the stairs, looking back down at the front door. In her mind, she tried to imagine Ariel arriving for the first time, but the image wouldn't come. Instead, she saw shadows moving through the house at night, familiar, with every corner and corridor. In her room, Chloe sat on her bed and pulled out the small tablet Dylan had given her for schoolwork. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, accessing the simple drawing program he'd installed. But instead of drawing pictures for art class, she began to sketch the layout of their house, every room, every doorway, every piece of furniture she could remember. Then she started marking the places where Ariel had moved without hesitation. The spoon drawer, the path around the loose floorboard, the way she'd automatically step to the left when entering the kitchen, as if she knew that the door swung inward and could hit someone standing too close. Downstairs, Dylan was showing Ariel the heart-secure control room, where dozens of monitors displayed feeds from cameras throughout the property. Mr. Rupert looked up from his keyboard as they entered. Rupert, this is Ariel Stone, our new UX designer, Dylan said. Ariel, meet Mr. Doyle. He built the architecture for our entire security system. Mr. Rupert nodded politely but didn't get up from his chair. He was a man who believed in the power of technology over intuition, algorithms over hunches. Ms. Stone, you'll find our system is quite sophisticated. Everything is logged, everything is monitored. We have complete visibility into every aspect of this property. Ariel smiled and moved closer to the monitors, studying the feeds with professional interest. It's impressive, she said. Very comprehensive coverage. How long do you keep the archived footage? 2 years of complete records, Mr. Rupert said proudly. Every entry, every movement, every system access is documented. As they talked, Ariel's eyes moved across the monitors with practiced efficiency. She was memorizing camera angles, noting blind spots, calculating distances and timing. But to Dylan and Mr. Rupert, she simply appeared to be an engaged professional asking the right questions. Outside in the garden, Mrs. Nora paused in her weeding. Something had disturbed the lavender bed near the house's foundation. Not recently, but the soil had a memory. She ran her fingers through the earth, feeling the subtle displacement that spoke of footsteps taken many months ago. The plants remembered too in their own way. They grew differently in places where strangers had walked, as if the ground itself held onto the echo of unfamiliar presence. Back upstairs, Chloe was getting dressed for school, but her mind was still working on the puzzle that had started at breakfast. She thought about the way her birth mother used to move through their old house, confident, automatic, never needing to think about where things were. That was how you moved through a space that belonged to you. That was how Ariel had moved through their kitchen. The rest of that first day passed in a rhythm that should have felt normal. Chloe went to school, where she sat through math and reading lessons while her mind remained fixed on the image of Ariel reaching for that spoon drawer. Dylan worked in his office, occasionally checking the monitors to see Ariel settling into her temporary workspace in the mansion's converted library. She seemed professional, focused, exactly what they needed. But when Chloe returned from school, she didn't head straight to her room as usual. Instead, she found Mrs. Nora in the garden, carefully transplanting seedlings into larger pots. "Mrs. Nora," Chloe said, sitting cross-legged on the grass beside the older woman, "do you remember everyone who's worked here?" Mrs. Nora's weathered hands paused in their work. In the 5 years since Chloe had come to live with Dylan, the child had rarely initiated conversations. She was polite, well-behaved, but kept her thoughts to herself. This question felt important. "I remember most everyone, dear," Mrs. Nora said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Chloe pulled at the grass, organizing the blades by length, a nervous habit that helped her think. The new lady, Ariel, she knew where things were in the kitchen. Mrs. Nora studied Chloe's face. The child had an intensity that reminded her of her own grandmother, who'd claimed she could sense when storms were coming days before they appeared on any weather forecast. Some people were just more attuned to the world around them. What kind of things did she know? Mrs. Nora asked. Where the spoons were, how to walk without stepping on the squeaky board. She looked at the camera corner, just for a second. Chloe's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were troubled, like she was checking to make sure it was still there. Mrs. Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. She'd been tending these gardens for over a decade, and she'd learned to pay attention to the subtle signs that others missed. Plants responded to human presence in ways that most people didn't understand. They remembered disturbances, even old ones. "Chloe," Mrs. Nora said slowly, "you know that basement entrance by the utility room? The one that leads to Mr. Rupert's office?" Chloe nodded. She'd been down there a few times with Dylan when he needed to check something on the main system. "Yesterday, when I was working on the herb garden near that side of the house, I noticed something odd. The lavender there grows differently than it should. Like something heavy had walked through it a long time ago and it never quite recovered." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them understanding that they were talking about something bigger than damaged plants. "What should we do?" Chloe asked. Mrs. Nora considered this carefully. She'd seen enough in her 78 years to know that adults didn't always listen to children, even when children were right. Especially when children were right about things that made grown-ups uncomfortable. "We watch," she said finally. "We pay attention, and we trust what we see." Inside the house, Ariel was wrapping up her first day, saving her work and preparing to leave. But before she powered down her laptop, she took a moment to access a hidden partition on her hard drive, one that wouldn't show up in any casual inspection. Inside were detailed floor plans of the Hart Mansion, security camera specifications, and system access logs that dated back 2 years. She'd spent months preparing for this return, crafting a new identity, building a portfolio impressive, enough to get her back inside these walls. The first time she'd been here, she'd been sloppy, overconfident. She'd thought Dylan's security was impressive, but not impenetrable. She'd been wrong about that, but she'd also learned from her mistakes. This time would be different. This time, she had legitimate access, a reasonable cover story, and all the time in the world to complete what she'd started. The AI technology that Dylan had developed wasn't just worth millions. It was the kind of breakthrough that could reshape entire industries. And this time, she wouldn't trigger any alarms when she took it. What she hadn't counted on was being remembered by a 9-year-old girl who noticed everything. Mr. Rupert was running his evening system check when Dylan knocked on the office door. "How did our new designer do today?" Dylan asked. "Competent," Mr. Rupert said, without looking up from his screens. Asked intelligent questions about the interface. Seemed genuinely interested in understanding how the system works. Dylan nodded, but something nagged at him. "Rupert, when was the last time we had a security breach? Even a minor one?" Mr. Rupert's fingers paused on the keyboard. "You know about the incident 18 months ago. Someone tried to access our network remotely, but we caught it immediately. They never got past the first firewall." "Right, but I mean physical access. Someone actually in the house." "Never," Mr. Rupert said firmly. "Every entry is logged, every movement is tracked. If someone had been inside this house without authorization, we would know about it." But even as he said it, Mr. Rupert felt a small doubt creeping in. The logs showed what the system recorded, but what if someone had found a way to avoid the system entirely? What if there were blind spots he hadn't considered? Upstairs, Chloe was supposed to be doing homework, but instead, she was staring out her bedroom window at the driveway where Ariel's car had been parked earlier. In her mind, she was trying to piece together the fragments of memory that had been bothering her all day. She remembered waking up one night about a year ago, hearing sounds that didn't belong to the house's normal nighttime rhythm. She'd gotten up to look out her window and had seen a figure moving across the garden, someone who knew exactly where to step to avoid the motion sensors that Mr. Rupert was so proud of. At the time, she'd convinced herself it was a dream. Foster kids learned early not to report things that might make adults think they were difficult or traumatized. But now, watching the empty space where Ariel's car had been, Chloe was beginning to wonder if that figure in the garden had been real after all, and if it had been, then Ariel Stone wasn't who she claimed to be. The next morning brought with it a restless energy that seemed to permeate the entire mansion. Chloe woke before her alarm, her mind already racing with questions that demanded answers. She'd spent half the night thinking about that shadowy figure in the garden, and the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that it hadn't been a dream. At breakfast, Dylan seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently than usual. "Everything okay?" Chloe asked, surprising him with the directness of her question. "Just work stuff," Dylan said, but there was tension in his voice. "We've been getting some unusual network activity alerts. Probably nothing, but it's got Mr. Rupert a little on edge." Chloe's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "What kind of unusual activity?" Dylan studied his foster daughter's face. Sometimes he forgot how intelligent she was, how much she understood about the world despite her age. "Someone's been probing our external security, testing for weaknesses. It's not uncommon in our industry, but the timing." He trailed off, shaking his head. "The timing of what?" "Well, it started the day before Ariel arrived for her interview. Could be coincidence, but I've learned not to believe in coincidences when it comes to security." As if summoned by their conversation, Ariel appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking fresh and professional in a crisp white blouse and dark slacks. "Good morning," she said brightly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Dylan said, though Chloe noticed how quickly he put his phone face down on the table. "How was your first day yesterday? Feeling comfortable with the system?" "Very comfortable," Ariel replied, and something about the way she said it made Chloe's skin prickle with awareness. "Mr. Doyle's architecture is incredibly sophisticated. I can see why you're so confident in your security." Chloe watched as Ariel moved through the kitchen again, this time paying attention to every gesture, every glance. Ariel opened the refrigerator and reached immediately for Dylan's preferred coffee creamer, a specific brand that was stored behind several other containers. She knew which cabinet held the travel mugs and which drawer contained the coffee filters. These weren't lucky guesses or obvious deductions. This was familiarity born from experience. After breakfast, as Dylan and Ariel headed off to discuss the day's work, Chloe made a decision that would have surprised the adults who thought they knew her so well. Instead of getting ready for school, she slipped downstairs to the basement level where Mr. Rupert's office was located. She found the older man hunched over his monitors, studying lines of code that scrolled past faster than Chloe could follow. "Mr. Rupert?" she said softly. He looked up, startled. Chloe, shouldn't you be getting ready for school? I need to ask you something, she said, stepping closer to his desk. Those logs you talked about yesterday, the ones that record everything. Could I see them? Mr. Rupert's eyebrows rose. That's not really appropriate, dear. The security logs contain sensitive information. But you said everything is recorded, right? Every entry, every movement? Well, yes, but what about 18 months ago? Around March 21st, 2023? The specific date made Mr. Rupert pause. How do you know about that date? Chloe took a breath. She was about to cross a line that she couldn't uncross, and she knew it. Because that's when she was here before. Ariel, I remember now. Mr. Rupert stared at her for a long moment. Then, against his better judgment, he turned to his computer and began typing. March 21st, 2023, he muttered. Let me see. The screen filled with data, timestamp after timestamp showing normal system operations. But then, abruptly, there was a gap. From 2:17 a.m. to 4:33 a.m., there were no entries at all. That's odd, Mr. Rupert said, frowning. There should never be a gap in the logs. Even if all systems were functioning normally, there would still be regular status updates. Chloe moved closer to the screen. What could cause that? Someone would have to physically disconnect the logging server, Mr. Rupert said slowly. But that would require access to this room and knowledge of exactly which cables to disconnect to create a gap without triggering emergency protocols. They stared at the screen together, the implications slowly sinking in. Someone had been in the house 18 months ago, someone with sophisticated knowledge of their security system, someone who had carefully erased their digital footprints, but hadn't counted on being remembered by a 7-year-old girl who never forgot a face or a feeling. Mr. Rupert, Chloe said quietly, could you check Ariel's laptop? See what device ID it has? The older man's fingers flew over the keyboard. Within minutes, he had pulled up the device registry for their network. Ariel's laptop showed as a new addition, registered just yesterday when she'd first connected to their Wi-Fi, but as Mr. Rupert dug deeper into the historical logs, his face went pale. There, he whispered, pointing at the screen. March 20th, 2023. The day before the gap. A device with the same MAC address as Ariel's current laptop connected to our network. Chloe felt vindicated and terrified at the same time. She'd been right, but being right meant that they were all in danger. What do we do now? Mr. Rupert was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence on his screen. As a man who had built his career on facts and verifiable data, he was struggling to accept what the evidence was telling him, but the numbers didn't lie. We need to tell Dylan, he said finally. But even as he said it, they could hear footsteps in the corridor above, Dylan and Ariel returning from their morning meeting. And suddenly, the idea of confronting someone who had already demonstrated the ability to infiltrate their supposedly impenetrable security seemed a lot more complicated than either of them had imagined. Chloe looked up at Mr. Rupert. She's going to know we found out, she said. If we tell Dylan while she's here, she'll hear us talking. She'll run away again. Mr. Rupert nodded slowly. The child was right. If Ariel was really the intruder, from 18 months ago then she was dangerous and intelligent. Cornering her without a plan could put everyone at risk. Then we need to be smart about this, he said. We need proof that she can't explain away. When the enemy is already inside your walls, every move must be calculated perfectly. By lunchtime, Mr. Rupert had convinced himself that the responsible thing to do was to present the evidence to Dylan immediately. The MAC address match was irrefutable proof that Ariel's laptop had been in their house before, and the gap in the security logs from that same time period was too significant to ignore. He found Dylan in his office reviewing project timelines, while Ariel worked quietly at the desk across the room. The scene looked perfectly normal, employer and contractor collaborating on a legitimate project. But Mr. Rupert now saw it differently. He saw a predator who had gained access to their most sensitive systems. Dylan, Mr. Rupert said, his voice carrying more urgency than he'd intended. "I need to speak with you privately. It's about the security logs." Dylan looked up, noting the older man's tense expression. "Is everything all right? Can it wait until—" "No," Mr. Rupert interrupted. "It can't wait." Ariel glanced up from her work, her expression showing polite curiosity. "I can step out if you need privacy," she offered. "Actually," Mr. Rupert said, his confidence growing as he thought about the evidence he'd discovered, "this concerns you too, Mrs. Stone." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dylan sensed the shift immediately, his own anxiety spiking as he recognized the tone in Mr. Rupert's voice. The same tone he'd used 2 years ago, when they'd discovered that Dylan's former business partner had been stealing proprietary code. "What's going on, Rupert?" Dylan asked carefully. Mr. Rupert pulled out a tablet, the screen showing the damning evidence he and Chloe had uncovered. "Your new designer's laptop was connected to our network 18 months ago, the same night that we had a mysterious gap in our security logs." Ariel went very still, but her expression remained calm. "I'm sorry, but I think there must be some mistake. I've never been here before yesterday." "The MAC address doesn't lie," Mr. Rupert said firmly. "Your device was here on March 20th, 2023. Dylan felt the familiar sensation of his world tilting, off its axis. He looked between Mr. Rupert's grim certainty and Ariel's apparent confusion, trying to process what he was hearing. And then Ariel did something that completely derailed Mr. Rupert's accusations. She started to cry. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that seemed to come from genuine shock and hurt. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Are you saying you think I'm some kind of criminal?" Dylan felt his protective instincts kick in. Ariel looked so young suddenly, so vulnerable. The idea that this creative professional, who'd impressed him with her portfolio and enthusiasm, was actually a sophisticated hacker seemed absurd. "There has to be an explanation," Dylan said, though he was looking at Mr. Rupert with growing suspicion. "MAC addresses can be spoofed, can't they? Someone could have cloned her device signature." Mr. Rupert felt his certainty wavering. "Well, yes, theoretically, but—" "And you said yourself that our network has been probed by hackers before," Dylan continued. "Isn't it possible that someone targeted us specifically because they knew we were hiring? They could have researched our new employees and chosen to impersonate Ariel's device to throw suspicion on her." Ariel wiped her eyes, looking grateful for Dylan's defense. "That's exactly what must have happened," she said. "Someone wanted to frame me. Maybe they knew I was getting this job and thought they could use me as a scapegoat." It was a reasonable explanation, and it played into Dylan's existing paranoia about external threats. He'd been betrayed before by someone he trusted, and the idea that outsiders were trying to manipulate him through an innocent employee was easier to accept than the possibility that he'd made the same mistake again. Mr. Rupert looked between them, feeling his confidence crumble. The evidence had seemed so clear in the basement office, but now, faced with Ariel's tears and Dylan's logic, he began to doubt himself. He was 72 years old, and maybe he was becoming paranoid in his old age. I suppose that's possible," he admitted reluctantly. But it was Chloe's voice from the doorway that cut through the tension like a blade. She knew where the basement electrical panel was. All three adults turned to see the 9-year-old standing in the entrance to Dylan's office, her school backpack still on her shoulders. She must have just returned from school and heard their voices. "Chloe," Dylan said gently, "this is a grown-up conversation. You shouldn't—" "Yesterday," Chloe continued, her voice steady despite the way her hands were shaking. "When you were showing her the house, she knew not to touch the electrical panel in the basement because it has that loose wire that sparks. But you didn't tell her about that. You never tell anyone about that because you keep meaning to get it fixed." The room fell silent. Dylan felt something cold settle in his stomach because Chloe was right. The electrical panel was a minor hazard that he'd been procrastinating about for months. He was careful around it, but he'd never mentioned it to Ariel. Ariel's tears had stopped. Her expression was still sad, but now there was something else there too. Something that reminded Dylan of a cornered animal deciding whether to run or fight. I didn't go near any electrical panel, Ariel said carefully. Yes, you did, Chloe replied. When Dylan was showing you the server room, you saw the panel and you stepped away from it, like you knew it was dangerous. Mr. Rupert was staring at Ariel now with renewed suspicion. How would you know about a safety hazard that isn't marked or documented anywhere? And that's when Ariel made her fatal mistake. Instead of trying to explain or deflect, she looked directly at Chloe with an expression that was no longer confused or hurt. It was calculating and cold. You're a very observant little girl, she said quietly. Maybe too observant for your own good. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Dylan felt every protective instinct he possessed surge to life. Whatever game was being played here, someone had just threatened his daughter. I think, Dylan said, his voice deadly calm. You need to leave. Now. But Ariel was already moving, her hand sliding toward her laptop bag with practiced efficiency. I'm afraid that's not going to be possible, she said. We have unfinished business, Dylan. Business that's been waiting 18 months to be completed. The transformation was startling in its completeness. The vulnerable, confused woman who had been crying moments before had vanished, replaced by someone whose every movement spoke of confidence and calculation. Ariel's posture changed, her expression hardened, and suddenly Dylan could see exactly what Chloe had been trying to tell him all along. My name is Ariel Stone, she said, her voice now carrying a different cadence entirely. But 18 months ago, I went by Blight. I was very good at what I did, Dylan. Good enough to get past your supposedly impenetrable security and into your precious AI development lab. Mr. Rupert was frantically typing on his tablet, likely trying to trigger security protocols, but Ariel seemed unconcerned. I wouldn't bother with that, Mr. Doyle. I've had 2 days to familiarize myself with your current system updates. Every alarm you try to trigger will be delayed by exactly 90 seconds. More than enough time for what I need to accomplish. Dylan stepped closer to Chloe, his mind racing through options and finding none of them good. They were in his office on the second floor, with Ariel between them and the only exit. The house's security system had been compromised, and the woman he'd trusted had just revealed herself to be the same hacker who'd nearly destroyed his company once before. What do you want? Dylan asked, though he already knew the answer. The same thing I wanted 18 months ago. Your AI development code. The recognition algorithms, the predictive modeling, all of it. Ariel reached into her laptop bag, but instead of pulling out a weapon, she retrieved a small device that looked like an ordinary USB drive. This time, however, I'm not leaving empty-handed. Chloe tugged on Dylan's sleeve. The camera in here, she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. Is it recording? Dylan's eyes flicked almost imperceptibly to the corner of the room where a security camera was hidden behind a decorative panel. If Mr. Rupert's system was still functioning, if Ariel's confidence was misplaced, then everything happening right now was being recorded. You won't get away with this again, Mr. Rupert said, his fingers still moving across his tablet. The authorities are already— No, they're not, Ariel interrupted. Because you haven't called them. You're all too smart to escalate a situation when there's a child in the room. But here's what's going to happen. Dylan is going to give me access to his development server. I'm going to copy what I need, and then I'm going to disappear again, this time permanently. And if I refuse? Dylan asked. Ariel's smile was cold. Then I'll make sure that your business partnership with the Department of Defense becomes very public. Did you know that your AI technology has been used in surveillance operations that would make your liberal friends very uncomfortable? The contracts you've signed, the applications you've agreed to develop. It would be such a shame if that information leaked. Dylan felt the blood drain from his face. The government contracts were classified, legitimate, but they could be spun to destroy both his company and his reputation. Ariel had done her homework, but it was Chloe who spoke into the tense silence. Mrs. Nora found something in the garden, she said loudly, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Under the lavender bushes. Ariel frowned, momentarily, confused by the non sequitur. What? A GPS tracking device, Chloe continued. and Dylan realized that his 9-year-old foster daughter was somehow taking control of the situation. Mrs. Nora found it this morning. It was attached to a hair clip that someone buried there about 18 months ago. Mr. Rupert's fingers paused on his tablet. Mrs. Nora hadn't told him about finding anything, but Chloe's voice carried absolute conviction. "That's impossible," Ariel said. But there was uncertainty in her voice now. "Is it?" Chloe asked. "Because Mrs. Nora also remembered that you wore your hair differently the last time you were here. Longer, with clips. She remembered because when you walked through her garden at night, you left one behind." Dylan watched Ariel's face carefully and saw the moment when doubt crept in. She was trying to remember details from 18 months ago, trying to calculate whether it was possible that she'd left evidence behind. "The police have the hair clip now," Chloe continued, her lies becoming more elaborate and convincing with each sentence. "They're running DNA tests. Mrs. Nora called them this morning after she found it. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation from a 9-year-old who understood that adults' fear of being caught often outweighed their ability to think logically." Ariel was beginning to panic, and panicked people made mistakes. "You're lying," Ariel said, but she was already moving toward Dylan's computer, her earlier confidence replaced by urgency. And that's when Mrs. Nora's voice carried up from the garden below, as if summoned by Chloe's words. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. The device is right here, just like the child said it would be." Dylan looked out the window and saw 2 police cars in his driveway, their lights flashing. He had no idea how they'd gotten there or why. But Chloe's improvised story was somehow coming true in real time. Ariel saw them too, and her careful planning finally crumbled. She grabbed the USB drive and jammed it into Dylan's computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to download what she'd come for before the police made it upstairs. But Mr. Rupert had been busy during their confrontation. While Ariel was focused on Chloe's story about DNA evidence, he'd managed to isolate Dylan's development server from the network. The USB drive was connected, but there was nothing for it to copy. "Looking for this?" Mr. Rupert asked, holding up his tablet to show that he'd moved all of Dylan's sensitive files to an offline backup. "I may be old, Ms. Stone, but I'm not stupid." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and Dylan realized that however this had happened, they were about to be rescued by forces he didn't understand. He pulled Chloe close and waited for Ariel to make her final move. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder, and Dylan could hear the distinctive sound of radio chatter that meant law enforcement was indeed in his house. But as he held Chloe close, watching Ariel's growing desperation, he realized that the most dangerous moments often came just before rescue arrived. Ariel stared at the computer screen, watching her carefully crafted plan dissolve into useless error messages. 18 months of preparation, months of building a false identity, weeks of planning her return. All of it was crumbling because a 9-year-old girl had noticed that she knew where the spoons were kept. "This isn't over," she said, yanking the USB drive from Dylan's computer. "You think you've won, but..." The office door burst open and 3 police officers entered with weapons drawn. But instead of the relief Dylan expected to feel, he saw something in Ariel's eyes that made his blood run cold. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Everyone stay calm," the lead officer said, his voice professionally steady. "Mrs. Stone, please step away from the computer and keep your hands visible." But Ariel was already moving, not toward surrender but toward the large window that overlooked the garden. In her hand was something Dylan hadn't seen before, a small device that looked like a garage door opener. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said, backing toward the window. "This technology shouldn't exist. The surveillance capabilities, the invasion of privacy. Dylan Hart is building tools for a police state, and you're protecting him." Chloe tugged on Dylan's shirt. "The backup power system," she whispered urgently. "She's going to trigger the backup power system." Dylan's eyes widened as he understood. The backup power system was connected to emergency protocols that would lock down the entire house in case of intrusion. Steel shutters over every window, reinforced door locks, a fortress mode designed to protect against external threats. If Ariel triggered it now with the police inside, they'd all be trapped together. "She has a remote trigger," Dylan called out to the officers. "Don't let her..." but Ariel was already pressing the button. Throughout the house, alarms began to sound, and Dylan heard the mechanical whir of security shutters beginning to descend. In 60 seconds, the Hart mansion would become an impenetrable vault, with all of them sealed inside. The lead officer lunged toward Ariel, but she was faster than expected. She vaulted over Dylan's desk and hit the window with a chair, shattering the glass just as the security shutter began to descend. For a moment, it looked like she might escape after all, but she hadn't counted on Mrs. Nora. The elderly gardener was standing directly below the window, holding a garden hose at full pressure, the moment Ariel appeared in the broken window frame. Mrs. Nora aimed the stream of water directly at her, sending her tumbling backward into the office and into the waiting arms of the police officers. As Ariel was handcuffed, Dylan managed to reach his emergency control panel and override the lockdown sequence. The alarms fell silent, and the security shutters retracted with a mechanical hum that sounded like the house itself sighing in relief. "How did you know?" Dylan asked Mrs. Nora as she appeared in the doorway, still holding her garden hose like a weapon. "The child told me what was happening," Mrs. Nora replied, nodding toward Chloe. "She used that little tablet of hers to send me a message while you were all talking. Told me to call the police and wait under the window." Dylan looked down at Chloe, who was still pressed against his side. "You planned all of this?" Chloe shook her head. "Not all of it. I knew she was lying about the hair clip. But I also knew that if I made her think we had evidence, she'd panic. And panicked people make mistakes." Mr. Rupert was staring at his tablet where security feeds showed police officers securing the rest of the house. "The DNA story," he said, slowly. "There really wasn't a hair clip, was there?" "Not until Mrs. Nora buried one this morning," Chloe said matter-of-factly. "I asked her to, in case we needed proof later." The lead police officer finished securing Ariel and turned to Dylan. "Sir, we received an emergency call reporting a break-in and possible data theft. The caller provided very specific information about the suspect's location and activities." Dylan looked at Mrs. Nora, who smiled innocently. "Well," she said, "the child was very thorough in her instructions." As the police led Ariel away, she turned back to look at Chloe one more time. "You have no idea what you've done," she said. "The technology your father is developing—" "Foster father," Chloe corrected quietly. "And I know exactly what I've done. I've protected my family." The simple statement hit Dylan like a physical blow. In all the months Chloe had lived with him, she'd never called him family before. She'd never called anyone family as far as he knew. After the police had gone and the house had returned to its normal rhythms, Dylan found himself in the garden with Chloe and Mrs. Nora. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lavender beds where this whole adventure had begun. "I owe you both an apology," Dylan said. "I should have listened when you tried to tell me something was wrong." Chloe shrugged. "Adults don't usually listen to kids about important things. We learn to work around that." Mrs. Nora laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "This one's special," she said, ruffling Chloe's hair. "She sees things the rest of us miss." "But how did you know?" Dylan asked Chloe. "Really know, not just suspect. What made you so certain?" Chloe considered the question carefully. She moved like she belonged here, she said finally. But she didn't belong here. People who belong somewhere don't have to think about where things are. But people who are pretending to belong, they have to remember. And sometimes they remember too well. 3 weeks later, the Hart mansion felt different. Not just because of the upgraded security measures that Mr. Rupert had insisted upon, or because of the media attention that had followed Ariel's arrest and the revelation of her sophisticated identity theft scheme. The house felt different because the people inside it had changed. Dylan found Chloe in the garden one evening, helping Mrs. Nora plant new lavender bushes to replace the ones that had been damaged during the investigation. The sight of his foster daughter covered in soil, actually smiling while she worked, was something he'd never expected to see. "How's the replanting going?" he asked, settling onto the grass beside them. "Mrs. Nora says lavender remembers everything," Chloe replied, carefully patting soil around a small plant. If we plant it right, it'll grow strong enough to warn us if anyone tries to walk through it again. Dylan watched her work, marveling at how much she'd changed in such a short time. The quiet, watchful child who'd arrived at his house 2 years, ego was still there, but now she seemed comfortable in her own skin, confident in her right to be heard. "Chloe," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something. That night you said you saw someone in the garden. Was that really 18 months ago?" Chloe's hands paused in their work. "It was real," she said quietly. "I saw her, but I didn't think anyone would believe me if I said anything." "Why not?" Chloe looked up at him with those serious dark eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Because foster kids who see things that adults don't want to believe usually get moved to different houses. I didn't want to get moved again." The words hit Dylan like a physical blow. For 2 years, his foster daughter had been carrying the burden of protecting not just his family, but her own place in it. She'd seen a real threat and had chosen to handle it alone, rather than risk being seen as a problem child. Mrs. Nora reached over and squeezed Chloe's muddy hand. "Well," she said firmly, "you're not going anywhere now. This is your garden too, and gardens need tenders who pay attention." Dylan felt something shift in his chest, a wall he'd been building around his heart finally crumbling completely. "Chloe," he said, "I need you to know something. You will never be moved from this house. Never. This is your home, for as long as you want it to be." "Even if I see things that other people don't?" she asked. "Especially if you see things that other people don't," Dylan replied. "You saved us all. Your gift for noticing details, for remembering what others forget, that's not something to hide. That's something to celebrate." As if to punctuate his words, Mr. Rupert appeared at the garden gate, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression of professional pride. "I wanted you both to see this," he said, showing them the screen. "The new security interface designed with input from our youngest consultant." Dylan looked at the display and saw that it was completely different from their old system. Instead of relying solely on electronic sensors and cameras, the new interface incorporated what Mr. Rupert had labeled human intelligence indicators. There were fields for logging unusual behavior patterns, notifications for when multiple household members reported the same concern, and even a special alert system for observations made by what the interface called high-sensitivity personnel. High-sensitivity personnel? Dylan asked. Mr. Rupert grinned, looking years younger than his 72 years. "That's the technical term for people like Chloe, individuals who notice patterns and anomalies that technology might miss. The best security systems aren't just electronic. They're collaborative between human intuition and digital precision." Chloe studied the screen with the focused attention she brought to everything that interested her. "So if I see something weird, I can report it officially?" "More than that," Mr. Rupert said. "Your observations will be weighted as high-priority alerts. The system has been programmed to take your reports very seriously indeed." That evening, as the sun set over the mansion's grounds, Dylan found himself standing on his office balcony, looking out over the garden where Chloe and Mrs. Nora were, putting the finishing touches on their replanting project. The scene below looked peaceful, domestic, normal. But Dylan now understood that normal was something his family had fought for and won. Chloe looked up and waved at him. "The cameras work better when they have help," she called up to him. "Is that so?" Dylan called back. "Mrs. Nora says the plants remember who belongs here and who doesn't. And I remember everything else." She paused, then added with a grin that transformed her entire face, "We make a good team." Dylan felt tears prick at his eyes. For months, he'd been worried about whether he was enough for this remarkable child, whether a man who spoke better to computers than to people could ever be the father she needed. But he'd been asking the wrong question. The real question wasn't whether he was enough for her, it was whether he was smart enough to appreciate what she brought to their family. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "We make an excellent team." As darkness fell over the Hart mansion, The security cameras activated with their usual electronic precision. But now they were enhanced by something technology alone could never provide. The watchful eyes of a child who'd learned that home was something worth protecting, and the knowledge that sometimes the best security system was simply paying attention to the people who mattered most. Inside the house, the HeartSecure system logged its evening status report. All systems operational. All residents secure. All threats neutralized. But if you looked closely at the data logs, you might notice a new entry that appeared every night at precisely 9 p.m. Human Intelligence Network. Active and alert. Special recognition. Chloe Bennett, Chief Observer of Anomalies. It was a job title that had never existed before, but one that fit perfectly. 6 months after Ariel's arrest, the Hart Mansion had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and entirely new. The security upgrades were complete, the media attention had died down, and life had returned to something that resembled normal, except that normal now included a 9-year-old security consultant who took her role very seriously indeed. Chloe had grown into her position as the family's official observer with characteristic thoroughness. She maintained detailed logs of everyone who entered the property, noting not just their stated business but their behavior patterns, their familiarity with the house layout, and any details that seemed inconsistent with their purported reasons for being there. Dylan often found these logs both impressive and slightly amusing. Chloe's entries included observations like, "Mail carrier nervous today, looking over shoulder more than usual. Recommend checking for vehicles following postal route," and "New grocery delivery person spent too much time looking at security cameras, either very security conscious or conducting surveillance." But it wasn't just paranoia. Chloe's careful attention had already prevented 2 minor security incidents. A delivery driver who'd tried to enter unauthorized areas while Dylan was in meetings, and a supposed repair technician whose credentials hadn't checked out when Mr. Rupert investigated Chloe's concerns. More importantly, Chloe had blossomed into the confident, expressive child that Dylan suspected she'd always been beneath her protective shell. She laughed more often, asked endless questions about everything from computer programming to plant biology, and had even made friends at school, something that had seemed impossible just a year before. The transformation wasn't just Chloe's. Dylan had learned to trust his instincts about people, to value intuition alongside data, and to understand that the most sophisticated security system in the world was only as good as the humans who operated it. He'd also learned that being a father wasn't about having all the answers. It was about creating a safe space where questions could be asked and observations could be shared without fear. Mrs. Nora had become something between a grandmother and a co-conspirator to Chloe, teaching her not just about gardening but about the subtle ways that living things communicated danger and safety. Together, they'd created what they called the Garden Alert System, a network of plants and observation points that could detect disturbances long before electronic sensors triggered. Even Mr. Rupert had changed, evolving from a man who trusted only technology to someone who understood that the best security came from combining digital precision with human wisdom. He'd begun teaching Chloe basic programming, and she'd shown an aptitude for logical thinking that impressed even his high standards. But the most significant change was in the way they functioned as a family. The crisis with Ariel had forced them to trust each other completely, and that trust had become the foundation for something neither Dylan nor Chloe had expected to find, a sense of belonging that felt unshakable. On a warm Saturday morning, in September, Dylan found Chloe in the garden with Mrs. Nora, examining something in the soil with the focused intensity she brought to everything important. "What are we investigating today?" Dylan asked, settling onto the grass beside them. "Not investigating," Chloe said without looking up. "Planting. Mrs. Nora says if we put motion sensors here and here and plant the right kind of flowers around them, no one will even notice they're there." "Are we expecting more uninvited guests?" Dylan asked. Chloe finally looked up, and Dylan was struck by how much older she seemed than her 10 years. Not in a concerning way, but in the way of someone who'd learned important lessons about protecting what mattered. "We're not expecting trouble," she said seriously. "But we're ready for it if it comes. That's different." Mrs. Nora smiled, her weathered hands gentle as she helped Chloe position the sensor among the flower bulbs. The child understands something that took me decades to learn, she said. Safety isn't about building walls, it's about building awareness. As they worked together in the garden, Dylan reflected on how much his definition of security had changed. A year ago, he'd believed that safety came from technology, from systems and algorithms and digital barriers. Now he understood that real security came from people who cared enough to pay attention, who trusted each other enough to share their concerns, and who were brave enough to act when action was needed. The Heart Secure system was more advanced now than it had ever been. But its greatest asset wasn't its cameras or sensors or artificial intelligence. Its greatest asset was a 10-year-old girl who noticed everything, remembered everything, and had learned that home was something worth protecting. That evening, as Dylan tucked Chloe into bed, a ritual they'd developed over the past few months, she looked up at him with the serious expression that meant she was about to say something important. "Dylan," she said, "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Nora said, about safety being awareness. What about it? I think families are like that too. Being a family isn't about being perfect or never having problems. It's about paying attention to each other and being ready to help when help is needed." Dylan felt that familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Chloe said something that revealed the depth of her understanding. "Is that what we are?" he asked softly. "A family?" Chloe nodded, settling deeper into her pillows. "We're a family that watches out for each other. That's the best kind." As Dylan turned off the lights and left Chloe's room, he paused at the window that overlooked the garden. The security lights cast gentle pools of illumination across the carefully tended beds, where sensors hidden among the flowers stood ready to detect any disturbance. It was a perfect metaphor for what they'd built together: beauty and protection, technology and intuition, safety that enhanced rather than restricted their ability to live fully. His phone buzzed with the evening security report from Mr. Rupert's system. "All perimeters secure, all residents safe. Human intelligence network operational and alert." Dylan smiled and headed downstairs to check the locks, not because he didn't trust the electronic systems, but because some rituals were worth maintaining. As he moved through the house, he noticed the small details that had become precious to him. Chloe's tablet on the kitchen counter, charged and ready for her morning review of overnight security logs. Mrs. Nora's gardening gloves by the back, door soil-stained from the day's work. Mr. Rupert's coffee mug in the sink, evidence of another late night spent perfecting their digital defenses. These were the signs of a life lived by people who cared about each other, who worked together to create something stronger than any of them could build alone. It wasn't the life Dylan had planned, but it was infinitely better than anything he could have imagined. Outside, the garden kept its silent watch, plants and sensors working together to guard the boundaries of their world. And upstairs, a remarkable little girl slept peacefully, knowing that she was home at last, in a place where her gifts were valued and her observations were heard. The Hart Mansion stood secure against the night, protected not just by technology, but by the more powerful force of people who'd chosen to become family, who'd learned to trust each other completely, and who understood that the best security system of all was simply paying attention to what mattered most. Every family has its own way of defining safety, love, and belonging. What matters isn't perfection. It's awareness, trust, and the courage to protect what we hold dear. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of unexpected families and the wisdom that emerges when we truly listen to each other. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths.